Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining eCHO session 125 with today's special guest. If you'd like to quickly give us an introduction to yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm Mike Zappa. I actually go by my last name as there's just too many Mikes. I was actually in the Marines, so the last name basis kind of just stuck. I'm currently a software engineer at Microsoft with the Azure Container Networking team and mostly do a lot of work related to open source and Linux container networking. My background is in networking systems and software engineering and the open source community. I'm one of the CNI container D maintainers and SIG network chairs. And really, also outside of work, I'm a rock climber and trail runner.
Nice. So a lot of different areas to focus on.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's the all vertical slice of all Kubernetes networking.
Yeah, but I'm also a container D as well. I think I didn't realize you were a maintainer of container D. I think I accidentally missed that off the intro, so sorry about that. But yeah, that's runtime network. There's only storage kind of missing, I think, there.
Oh, yeah. Storage, that's a different beast.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. Fantastic. Cool. So before we kind of kick things off, as normal, we'll kind of quickly do some bits that have been in the news, at least from a Cilium and networking perspective. So Cilium 1.15 was released last week. A load of new BGP features, a load of new additional enhancements that have been added to the Cilium CNI. iSurveillance, the company that's kind of largely working on Cilium, celebrates its 7th birthday. And finally, Cilium has its own Wikipedia page that we've finally managed to get published after going through all of the Wikipedia backwards and forwards. So you can read all about the history of Cilium now on Wikipedia. And events. So we recently in the UK just had the State of Open Source. So a full week of events all around open source governance, getting started in open source, best practices, and things like that. Not to anybody's surprise, but as KubeCon is always looming in the distance, we're just under 40 days until the next KubeCon, followed by the next KubeCon, followed by the one after that. But yeah, there's the CiliumCon will be taking place. There's going to be all of the EdgeCon, the maintainer tracks, and then 3 full days of KubeCon to follow afterwards. So as always, if you are in attendance either virtually or physically, please come find any member of the Cilium teams or any of the maintainers. If you have questions, come find us and we will do what we can. So yeah, that's obviously Cilium. KubeCon is always coming up in the events. There's also SRECon, which is also going to be taking place in March as well. So there's a lot on the calendar right now. So before we kick things off, we have a hello from Justin here. So hi, Justin. Thank you for joining, along with everybody else that's watching at the moment. This is going to be a bit of just an interactive conversation between myself and Mike. But if you do have any questions around any of the things, whether that be rock climbing, whether that be container networking in general, the various SIGs and maintainer tracks that Mike is part of, then please drop your questions into the chat and we will answer them as best as possible. So I think to kick things off, really, yeah, how did you end up being part of kind of all of these various groups inside the Kubernetes project?
Yeah, definitely. Well, from the Kubernetes perspective, I got involved with Kubernetes a while ago, probably 5 years ago or something around that. I was actually working at a networking startup and we were migrating away from Apache Mesos to Kubernetes. We were actually running like the kubelet on Mellanox switches. And, we had some very unique requirements around running customer BGP instances. And after that, I kind of started seeing the value in, Kubernetes and what it could do for networking, especially as once you have the kubelet running on a switch, you're kind of starting to look at, what else can it do? And that's how I was like, looking at Sonic, the network operating system, was like, okay, well, we can kind of turn Kubernetes into a network management plane for data centers. So that's from the Kubernetes perspective. From the CNI perspective, it kind of seemed like a natural fit for me just with my background. I've always, been rather passionate about networking. So I think I started my journey with the CNI and Containerd in Kubernetes because I was like, oh, be a valiant effort to actually implement the check command. And which is kind of funny because a lot of people pick that up and then we find that it goes through so many different layers that it's actually not as trivial as we'd like it to be. So I kind of put that back down, but started, reviewing PRs and, hacking around and finding ways to, do very obscure things with Kubernetes networking.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more that I get involved with this, the more kind of crazy networking things I tend to see. But I couldn't help but hear that you're running kubelet on switches. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, at my previous startup, we were stateless. We actually had the kubelet running on, I think they're like SN 3700 Spectrum switches.
Okay.
So yeah, you can. I mean, they're running a full Linux operating system, so you can actually
Okay.
schedule pods on them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's not uncommon. I think we're finding now that a lot of the control plane on top of rack switches and things like that tend to be now Linux based, and often kind of the various parts are containerized to a certain degree and things like that. I suppose before we delve into it a little bit, so you kind of were involved from an end user perspective and then reviewing PRs. For people that don't really know, the CNI, so there's the CNI, the CRI, the CSI. The CNI, can you kind of give a brief overview of what the CNI kind of actually is and kind of what the role of it and the roadmap, I guess, to a certain degree is?
Yeah, well, how the CNI became a thing was back in the day. I think it really predates myself. I think it was like around 2015, 2016. Casey would be the authority on this, but the CNI came into the picture with CoreOS as a part of the Rocket container runtime to make a common interface for network plugins for container runtimes and orchestrators. And like Docker had like
libnetwork.
Yeah, libnetwork, or it's like, was that like the CNM or container network?
Oh, the CNM.
Something
Yeah.
as like an alternative. And, it kind of seemed like, probably multiple companies were doing, container networking the very similar ways. It probably seemed reasonable to standardize. Like, how many people in the networking Kubernetes space are not using vETHs? I would say like 99% are using a vETH with like a VXLAN interface or some Linux bridge here and there. So I think that was, how it kind of came to be.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't know it came out of Rocket. I suppose for those that don't know, Rocket is now it's an archived project that came out of the CoreOS company project or whatever, which was basically an alternative to Containerd and it kind of came and went all within like a few short years, basically, to the Rocket project.
Yeah, well, I think CoreOS got acquired by Red Hat, and then Red Hat has Cryo, so I was like, maybe that's where kind of came into the picture, left the picture.
Yep. So yeah, so the CNI effectively is, as mentioned, it's the interface for the Kubernetes project to downstream basically configure how things are plumbed in. Additionally to the CNI is the CRI and the CSI. CRI is the runtime interface. So when you schedule things, the CRI will then speak to something through that interface, which will start the containers actually up and running. The CNI will then speak to the network plugin, which will bring up the networking side of things. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I didn't really realize this. It was thanks to you showing me this, but I always presumed, because I hadn't looked at the code, that Kubernetes would speak CRI, or it does speak CRI, or kubelet speaks CRI. The Kubernetes project speaks CRI. It doesn't speak CNI, though. It doesn't speak directly to the networking. Yeah, really weird. Like,
yeah, a lot of people, like, I actually did a poll a long time ago, and I was like, hey, if you were to just look at the CRI proto, and the CRI's API is actually two services, runtime service and the image service. And most people are like, I think networking happens on the create containers, which actually isn't, the case in the current architecture. It actually happens in run pod sandbox. So that's where the CNI add is called. And then stop pod sandbox is where CNI delete is called. And the thing about like that is like, where you assume the CNI add is being executed, that run pod sandbox would also be returning IP addresses. That's not the case either. It's actually pod sandbox status is what is returning, like, hey, telling the kubelet, here's my IP addresses for this pod. So in this case, the kubelet is like the cry client, and then container D or cryo implements, the cry server as a cry plugin.
Very confusing. Yeah, I mean, it seems it seems kind of bonkers to me that like the chain of events went that way, and there's no way really for kubelet to really directly speak to the networking side of things. Like it literally is a client of a client at this point, and like, like,
yes.
and that. So from the kubelet's perspective, it can't really ask the CNI what's left in your IPAM or.
Yep, exactly. Well, and that's like the big thing is like the CNI is orchestrator agnostic. So Kubernetes doesn't know about the CNI. CNI doesn't know about Kubernetes, which comes to like a disadvantage, as like, if I were just to take a tactical step backwards and say, as a reader of the code, where does network setup happen? And it's really confusing. And you raised a great point about IPAM. Because what happens today when you call CNI add and, you've exhausted all your IP addresses, that kubelet's just like, meh, I'm just going to keep rescheduling this and go into a, near infinite, crash loop. So there needs to be, I think that's like, the big, effort, it's like, we probably need to look at this again.
Yeah.
And I think, some people back in the day, there was like KubeNet, which had all the networking built in. And I think, obviously being a little too coupled, that probably didn't work so well. So then it was decoupled. And now we're looking at again as like, CNI KubeNet maybe had some ideas that we can borrow and improve.
Yeah. So the CNI itself, like, I mean, the standard was ratified. Yeah, I guess quite some time ago. How much, from your perspective, I suppose it's not something that I've ever looked at. I mean, I know a lot of work goes into the plugin sides of things, given that I'm quite close to the Cilium project. But from the CNI itself, how much, how much work kind of goes in? How regular are people kind of looking at the spec and looking at adding to it and kind of upgrading it, as it were, and evolving it?
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a small group of individuals that are like, improving the spec. We just released CNI 1.1, which added like the status verb and the GC verb, which, helped status in particular was like kind of to say like, hey, am the network ready? And, other specific items like that. However, like talking about the cry again, we're obviously limited by, network ready is really just a true or a false. So it was like, what happens if you set, status call says IPAM's out of IP addresses, sets the node not ready, then evicts all your healthy pods. So, we have those new verbs. And I think GC came out of like discussions, Casey was driving that in particular to, I think, clean up, various items, eBPF programs and more. So, and we're looking at a new release, hopefully, RC at, the near future, to add some additional fields to the interface struct is the big piece.
Yeah. And I suppose given how much kind of the architecture is basically the architecture, and it's going to take some monumental shifts to kind of change all of that. So kind of what we're really left with at the moment is just kind of almost embellishing the messages that kind of be sent back at this point. Is that kind of where we're kind of left with at the moment?
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of like we're limited by the current CRI interface, because once you start touching that, or you need additional functionality, then it's the, all the layers, even like down to the kata layer, is like you got to do changes container runtime, the CRI API, the kubelet. So it turns into a rather large effort to start making, seismic changes.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's going to be quite interesting. Well, it is just the way it is at the moment, I suppose. There's not really much without major intervention that's going to do all of that, and then any major intervention is going to require, depending on the implementation of it, but changes in the CRI spec perspective, potential changes to the runtime engines themselves to a certain degree, and things like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I suppose for people who are, kind of wanting to get involved in things like the CNI project, kind of what's your advice? Is there any obvious kind of path in terms of getting involved in, that side of things?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, where I always point people when they say, "Hey, I want to get involved with open source," and I always say, like, "Hey, what are you passionate about?" Because, like, say if you're really passionate about networking and now you're in the storage arena, that may not work out to your benefit. So I think it's like, one, if you're passionate about networking, Kubernetes networking, CNI actually is probably the best place to be. And just start somewhere, pick up one PR and say, "Hey, this looks good." Crawl, walk, run. Don't try to boil the ocean.
Yes,
I think it's like, the advice I always give people, because they're like, people are like, "Hey, I want to make a VXLAN plugin. I want to do data plane learning. I want to do eBPF, VXLAN." I was like, "That's cool. How much do you know about those areas?" And they're like, "Nothing." So I was like, "All right, what's a great foundational, level?" And, I think, small wins will, gain trust amongst the, the ecosystem. And that's much better than, I rather, over deliver than under deliver. So
yeah, I think one of the things that I'm pretty sure I saw on the KubeCon schedule for the upcoming one is creating, I think I've seen something similar before, but kind of creating a CNI from scratch as well, which I imagine probably be quite useful for people wanting to get involved.
Oh, definitely. That's great.
Yeah. So one of the other key areas that you're kind of focused in, and this is probably going to lead us on to some other conversation a little bit later down the line, is largely kind of the networking side of things. So there's inside of the Kubernetes project, not just from an implementation perspective, but from a governance perspective, we have the concept of the SIGs and the tags and things like that. There's tag networking, which is largely kind of overarching everything networking, what defines networking projects and things like that. And then there's the SIG networking kind of side of things to Kubernetes. And the SIG networking side at the moment seems largely one of the busiest kind of areas at the moment. Not just SIG networking itself, there's SIG networking gateway API, there's SIG multi-networking, there's SIG network policy, there's SIG network, just everything. So, I mean, that's a huge area at the moment, and you're kind of quite heavily involved from that perspective, being a chair. How did you kind of end up there?
End up like as a chair position, or just in everything?
Well, I mean, I guess what was as I say, it's quite a wide, varied net, because there are so many different kind of sub projects that are now in kind of the networking space. But being part of SIG networking, kind of, I know it's open forum, anybody can kind of join, but I often find a lot of people kind of know about these things, but don't really know should they join. What are the reasons for kind of going to these sorts of calls and things like that. So, I mean, how did you end up kind of getting there?
Oh,
And
I think it was just a logical progression. Like I started at the ground layer, and then the next logical stop was obviously like SIG-Network. And I had been like come and gone from that. And I was like, I think I should try to be more heavily involved with this simply because I was like, I really wanted to have the full view of Kubernetes networking, which involves CNI and container D. And then once you get into SIG network, we do have gateway API, we have multi-network, and all the other efforts. So it seemed, logical at that point to just go into that direction. Especially kube-proxy is obviously, a very important piece of the puzzle around services networking. So it was just part of my, strategy to be involved with hopefully everything networking.
yeah, fantastic. Yeah, as I say, there's so much happening in the networking space. From a Kubernetes perspective, there's kube-proxy is heavily being worked on. I think I remember into the maintainer summit at the last KubeCon where there was a lot of conversation about what to do next with kube-proxy. So for most people who don't tend to look under the covers, but kube-proxy originally was the manager of all of the IP tables rules in the world ever. It would basically, as you do things in your cluster, kube-proxy on all of the nodes will largely take what's happening inside the cluster and make the network work for that locally. And that was largely a lot of IP tables rules, many, many, many thousands of IP tables rules in some circumstances. And yeah, there's been work now. So there's, there was a lot of work originally moving from IP tables to nftables, but a lot of that was done through kind of wrapper scripts. So it would still write or shell out to IP tables, but there wasn't IP tables. It was actually some Python then that would read that and then actually write that to nftables rules. And the plan, I believe, moving forward is moving directly to nftables implemented probably in Go through a nftables library or something like that.
Yeah, Dan Winship would be the expert on the kube-proxy and how he's going to implement that.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so I think, yes, SIG-Networking is a fantastic place for getting started. The sub-projects that are part of all of that are, if you're looking at things like service mesh and evolution away from kind of the ingress controller spec, then looking at, kind of the network gateway API and all of the sub parts of all of that. But SIG networking itself is kind of largely focused with kind of stewarding the direction of things like the kube-proxy, things like kind of how services are defined within, how things are actually architected. So SIG networking is architecture and implementation to a certain degree. Would that be fair?
Yeah, definitely on a direction standpoint, and yeah, I think trying to solve the right problem with new efforts.
Yep, absolutely fantastic. So I think there's we're currently with the CNI at the moment. We have all of these groups that are looking at kind of the evolution of networking, the evolution of kube-proxy. So moving away from its implementation to a newer, more scalable implementation and things like that. I've started to see a lot of conversation now in terms of what's happening next with the CNI. So is there going to be a CNI version 2? Do we keep plumbing more bits or trying to hide stuff through, or is there something else on the horizon that people are kind of looking at as an obvious way in for this bit of the conversation, I think?
Yeah, well, from the future of the CNI, we've been talking, I mean, for like over a year, maybe even 2 years, it's like CNI 2.0 has always been talked about. And it was like the two main pieces was moving to a gRPC model. So like removing the execution model that we currently have and moving it closer to Kubernetes. So like, and when you think about it, like every Kubernetes network plugin is already running as like a daemon set. So, in this case, instead, the actual like Calico, Cilium, and more would simply implement the gRPC server side of, CNI 2.0, which really kind of was, a driver of like the KNI effort was, let's actually, put, code to, code down and see what this actually looks like, turning the kubelet into the gRPC client, which we kind of alluded to earlier. So we were talking about is like run pod sandbox. There's no actual like APIs to do this. So I think that is probably what the future is going to be. Like there's a lot of it's a lot of up in the air right now. Like there's like an obviously a KNI like working POC up. And yeah, so I think it's kind of right now is like, how does it all work together? Like, KNI, CNI, DRA, multi-network.
What's DRA? Sorry.
Dynamic resource allocation.
Oh, okay.
So that's not, another 3-letter acronym, in our ecosystem. However, yeah, it's kind of like actually at KubeCon, we're setting up a contributor summit and meetings, kind of like what is the future of Kubernetes networking. And I think hopefully, like it'll be the KNI.
Yeah.
Obviously,
So before we go into the KNI a little bit, let's kind of, if we can, break it down a little bit. Like what as we've discussed, like the Kubernetes can't speak to the CNI. That's one issue. But I mean, why is that an issue? What are the problems that we have? I mean, I guess a lot of things are hidden from the end user. Is that the main thing, or is there more things we're hoping to solve with a complete change in the way that Kubernetes kind of handles its networking?
Yeah, well, that's where the KNI kind of came out of. Is kind of like ideally, we made these decisions 8 years ago, quite a long time ago. And, we were like, hey, we need to take a second look at Kubernetes and evaluate kind of like what are our pain points and what can we improve? What can we improve? And that's kind of where we, kind of kicked off, all these conversations, like to be like, hey, should we move this closer to Kubernetes? Is the problem with Kubernetes networking is that it's 3 layers. It's Kubernetes, you have your kube-proxy, your network policy, your miscellaneous controllers, all making changes to the same resources. I mean, effectively, we're just making changes to network namespaces across, 3 uncoordinated layers. Is like now, like we talked about earlier, is like, hey, just implement this. Now it becomes a large effort because now it's like the container runtimes, the low-level container runtimes, or specifically the OCI runtimes that, Kata that do network startup part of a start task operation. So it's very complex when you start saying, hey, I want to make a change. However, now you have to go through 3 to 6 groups of people, or 3, or a dozen, depending on who you start talking to. And now you're like, well, it just turned into, me carrying a pebble up, the Matterhorn versus now me carrying a 2-ton object up a mountain. And it just became completely difficult to do so.
So this is the idea is really kind of simplifying the model to a certain degree. It's instead of one person asking somebody to do something else, it's effectively having kind of direct access to this particular as a resource as opposed to kind of just sub-dependencies and things like that. And so that, I mean, from an architectural perspective and probably for a development perspective, that's going to be in theory, a nicer experience. But from an end user perspective, I mean, what are there any gains that the end user really is going to see from this?
Well, it's actually like in the current kind of form, the end user probably won't know that anything's happening, just like they don't know the CNI ad is being executed. The API surface, as discussed, probably would be exactly the same. You probably can see, minute performance, deltas, increases because we're no longer executing, CNI binaries and more, or, we won't have hopefully no issues where we run out of IP addresses. We can hopefully say, hey, let's just route away from this node. We don't want to just go and evict all the healthy running pods. Mm-hmm. So from the end user perspective, hopefully, it's a little bit more seamless from their perspective. I mean, networking, when networking's running and working well, users should never know.
Yes.
It's only when it's broken, when they're saying, hey, something's up. They're like, hey, my IPAM's out of IP addresses, my pods aren't coming up, and now my workloads are I'm just getting 500s.
Yeah.
That's hopefully kind of from the user perspective.
I do love that. Yeah, it's almost a thankless task doing networking. It's like no one cares. No one says thank you when it's working, but they'll scream at you when it's certainly not working.
Oh, yeah.
I suppose, though, what I'm kind of thinking more is that if things like Kubernetes and the kubelet are able to directly interface with the networking side of things, we'll be able to expose, for admins and such and people who want to know about these things, we'll be able to kind of infer that knowledge back into kind of the control plane and things like that as well. So kind of kubectl get pod IPAM, or because I mean, from an admin perspective, you do your kubeadm init and you give some CIDRs and stuff like that, and then you kind of the cluster comes up and you don't really care until all of a sudden it realizes you gave a /24, but you've got no idea until things break that you did that or things like that. You know what I mean? Like it's all just so hidden away somewhere.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, having that visibility is, very important because it's like, hey, if you only have 2 more IP addresses left, that's a problem.
Yes.
So exactly. Visibility, a lot of people bake in, through service meshes, how to intercept traffic. And that's always like, this obscure, process, to implement that. So maybe we can make it more uniform and more intuitive for the users.
Very cool. And I suppose not just, exposing, I guess, kind of what's actually going on within the CNI back up to the cluster itself. Are we expecting the evolution of the CNI to potentially the KNI to give us more features in terms of more control over the network, maybe the network either within the server or even potentially further upstream and things like that?
Oh, definitely. I think we're quite limited in a few areas. Like we can really only do like attach and detach. And, if we want to make any changes, that requires pod to be rescheduled. In a lot of cases, that's not very desirable. So sometimes you want to say, hey, I want to add an interface into the pod, or I want to have multiple interfaces in the pod. Right now we do that via Multis. So I think we can have more control with the KNI in this case. We can also look at, say, hey, kube-proxy and network policy don't really have direct access to the network namespace path. Why don't we give that to them? Because we can say, arguably, kube-proxy makes use of a lot of DNAT. And while we move to IPv6, do we want to carry IPv4 constructs into the IPv6 world? So when we get the actual pod network namespace, we can start, actually, making changes to the pod network namespace. We can move more IP tables rules over there and possibly try to, solve some of the scalability issues. Maybe we want to do anycast routing and completely get rid of NAT from the picture. So those are kind of the items that I think, when we move Kubernetes, we consolidate Kubernetes networking to one layer, the Kubernetes layer, and not have all these others. I think we actually have an increased amount of flexibility to make significant improvements.
Yeah, I can certainly, I'm quite fortunate to kind of be involved in telco conversations semi-regularly and things like that. And Multus is generally things like I forgot what they're called now. So many acronyms. The container network functions, CNFs, and things like that.
Yeah.
They typically need to be connected to a number of networks in one go and things like that. And you're largely left with just Multus at the moment to try and plumb in additional interfaces, which kind of works, but Kubernetes doesn't understand that. Like, it understands one interface, and it will do the IP tables rules for that one interface and things like that. So services will work from that perspective. Those additional interfaces are ignored by Kubernetes, so it doesn't know about them and things like that. Presumably, with the way that the KNI model would work, we'd be able to also specify, if traffic comes in on a service on this interface and things like that, we could plumb in that additional logic from that perspective and make bigger Kubernetes networking objects, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Kubernetes doesn't even know about like ETH0 it just knows about an IP address. And KNI, I think we should look at was like, what information should Kubernetes know? And I think like having some sort of, slice of interfaces, IP address, the IP address name, IP address, interface name, and maybe MTU or something that we can make decisions off of, simply because we only know about the IP address, and Multus is great and they're actually heavily involved with the KNI discussions, but there's a big conceptual problem there is that when with Multus you have the network attachment definition, so it wouldn't be like my life if on a weekly basis I didn't say, hey, your network attachment definition deleted your default route. And that's why you don't have, where you just removed ETH0 and now you have a problem. So there's a, issue with coordination when Multus is obviously great. And I think, Doug Smith and, crew have always kind of envisioned this Kubernetes network runtime. And that's where, KNI was like, hey, well, why don't we just call network plugins network runtimes now? Because it handles all of, Kubernetes networking from, network namespace path creation and more. So it'll be pretty fascinating to see where things land, because we definitely need to do something rather than, nothing. And I think my big fear here is that we just talk about it and don't do anything.
Yeah.
So endless conversations.
So I guess, there's a couple of questions here, but first off, where in the journey are we with KNI then? I know it's pretty fresh for 2024, but where would you say it is at the moment?
Well, we just put up the cap, and it's kind of very new. So I think a lot of people have a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of confusion. So we're at that state where, it's just, it's breaching the perimeter defenses. And now we're kind of pushing through. So we have the cap up. We have a fully working demo. And in fact, I actually have it working.
Sorry, in my understanding, and I'm probably wrong, but isn't this going to require kubelet changes and things like that? Has that kind of already been proof of concept?
It requires actually the changes were much smaller than I originally anticipated. But it's like effectively like it. Actually, probably in my opinion, I made Kubernetes networking easier because I eliminated the container runtimes and the OCI runtimes completely they're no longer involved with networking at all. So now to making changes, you only need to update your network runtime or the gRPC server side. So, and funny enough, I actually got it working with Cilium the other day. I already saw some benefits. So it actually works with Flannel, Cilium, and a couple others. Actually, it works with Multis now too. So, we do see some small wins, but yeah, you actually your big effort was actually adding the CNI API like client library to the kubelet. And that was like the big hurdle. And then it was effectively feature flagging the container runtime code around CNI execution. So it turned to be a much smaller effort. There's some small changes here and there, but it was actually much smaller than anticipated.
Okay.
I know a lot of people, and that's why I did the demo, because I was actually saying, people are saying it's impossible. And I was like, that was my dog whistle. And I was like, no, it's actually much smaller than anticipated, like I thought. And, it actually only took a couple days to fully get working. And then I was like, oh, why don't we just solve some small problems? Like, let's put all the CNI binaries in, the container image. So we no longer actually have files in the host file system. And actually, it improved the network pod startup time. So, how Cilium usually takes, or Flannel would take, 20 to 30 seconds to start up. It takes 1 second to start up. So it's on average a 90% increase, in performance. So
I'm amazed. I was expecting this, just the proof of concept, I mean, like I've heard horror stories of the kubelet code. I don't know how bad it is, but like, I mean, it's
the kubelet is in definitely a state where people have come and gone in a non-uniform way. So when it comes to like networking, the biggest hurdle was that there was this one line of code that, like, for a day or so, I was like, I don't think I can get this working. So there's these small pieces of code. It's not very co-located. It's just spread across the kubelet code base. However, when I was writing the POC, I kind of took a step back and I was like, hey, as a reader of the kubelet code, where can I answer the question of where does network setup happen? And so even down to the file name, it's like, Kuber runtime network or something. And then there's attach and detach. So if one were just to string search, like attach interface or whatever, you can quickly find it. But yeah, the kubelet code definitely has some small landmines here and there.
Lovely.
Like commenting out just like a single line of code for like status will send your, pods into an endless restart cycle, that's, the name of the game. But, I think one of the ideas that we can probably improve the code base, make it more intuitive, by trying to offload a lot of it, because really, from the KNI perspective, the kubelet only needs to know about IP addresses, maybe interface names, and then everything else, endpoint slices, your kube-proxy, literally could be on its own, in its own ecosystem. Thus hopefully simplifying, core Kubernetes and reducing the changes to core Kubernetes in the process.
So that's incredible. I'm completely blown away. I was expecting like a proof of concept to be a year or so in the making or something or other like that, due to the areas, the blast radius of where this could potentially be.
Oh no. Well, most people don't understand all the moving pieces. And I think I've documented it to a point where I can have like dreams and articulate random lines of code of like, it's actually line 1845 in Kuber runtime manager.go.
I don't know if that's amazing or scary. I'm sorry.
It's probably not great. However, it did make doing the POC, rather easy because I was like, okay, I just need to, comment this out, add this library, implement this, move this code over here, and pretty much was done. Yeah, just a couple of days. I did commit
Amazing.
to stay up to like not go to sleep until it was working. So I
Dedication to
did
the
do
cause.
that to get
That's
it working.
incredible. So, we've kind of discussed a little bit then the problems with the CNI that exists today in terms of its 8-year-old architecture to a certain degree, the potential future of CNI v2, and then the pivot. Was it pivot to potentially the KNI? You already have a proof of concept. You already tested it. So CNIs typically aren't really going to require anything day one in order to kind of continue doing what they're doing. What's kind of next then for the KNI? Where's what's the hopes and dreams?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's like right now it's solidifying the cap, the goals, and the user stories. I was going to focus more on like the migration story, as that had been brought up several times. And luckily, with the KNI, it's completely backwards compatible with all network plugins. So, and that was a big concern. And actually, the KNI demo wraps CNI plugins in its current state. So it works in that way. So I think solidifying like, what is our crawl, walk, run process for, the migration story, ironing out the user stories, because I think that will be, the main focus. And it's also kind of like another area of focus would be like keeping the scope to something tangible, because the death sentence of any KEP is scope creep. So
Yes.
that's where the KNI is like, hey, I mentioned DRA, multi-network, and more. It's like I think we should position ourselves from being the foundational element so we can decrease their scope and move their efforts forward. So I think that's, where we're going to start heading. So it's just KEP process. So, that'll be painful, and, it'll be part of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there is now a SIG-Network KNI channel on the Kubernetes Slack for people that want to kind of join and ask questions and kind of learn more. There's now also a bi-weekly meeting. Is that correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. So if you join the SIG-Network community calendar, you will automatically be added to that. And I think it takes place on a Thursday, time zone dependent. My afternoon, your morning, wherever you are, it's for you to work out. But that's also a good place to obviously join and find out what's happening, other people's involvement and things like that. I joined the one last week, and I think there was about 30 people from a variety of different kind of backgrounds and companies on there as well, all kind of hashing things out for the future. So another fantastic place to kind of join. And so that's the KNI project. So it sounds like it's the train is leaving the station and people are jumping on board with that, which is very cool to hear. Fantastic. So we're coming up to pretty much the top of the hour. It's been 50 minutes or so. Kind of my last kind of final question for you, really, I suppose, is in the whole Kubernetes kind of space at the moment, KNI included, I suppose. But what are you really excited about that's kind of up and coming at the moment? Kind of might not be what you're working on, it might be something that you've kind of seen, or could just well be the KNI project. But what's kind of exciting you at the moment?
I mean, the KNI is pretty exciting, with people like actually messaging me, like Doug Smith is like, I got Multis working, or I'm working on like a native approach to Multis, and, doing multi-networking. I'm just excited that networking is becoming exciting again. I'm really passionate about networking, and now people are like, hey, this is a main focus. So whenever that's happening, I'm happy about it. There's obviously, I mentioned DRA multi-network. So, obviously, hopefully Kubernetes really getting involved with the AI, ML from the networking perspective. So
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to, I guess, my perspective to a certain degree as well. Kind of the financial trading side of things has new requirements on the network. Telcos have all of these new requirements on networks and things like that. Kind of Kubernetes networking in its first form was largely just this black box that nobody really needed to care about. Pods would get IP addresses and you'd expose stuff in a very simplistic manner to the outside world with things like cloud load balancers or simple ingress controllers and things like that. And that was largely the infrastructure that you had. That was it. And we've largely spent 7 years now unpicking that original network architecture, or bolting things on, or hacking ways of leaking traffic out one way or another, or doing whatever it is that we needed to do. And like after all this time, it's kind of refreshing to kind of see that, like, instead of us hacking holes in Kubernetes cluster, let's potentially look at just re-architecting like how we sit in environments that have these new requirements, multiple interfaces attaching to multiple networks, being able to kind of get a greater understanding of direct access to pods or whatever it is that we kind of need to do.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be fun to see, because to the point, I felt, everybody's been saying it's like networking's kind of bolted on for the setup and the teardown, and it's in a very odd location. And then, I find myself constantly explaining like how this happens, even though I've diagrammed it, made videos, and it's not very intuitive from a lot of end users perspective, because usually the Kubernetes idiomatic way is put everything in the container image. So when you have to break that pattern, you kind of find yourself in a little bit of a odd state.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that's pretty much everything for today. Before we go, is there anything you want to kind of add, or you ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna actually try to show a demo, but I actually in the middle of making the change. So I actually wrote a library called libkni, and I'm actually in the middle of adding that to Cilium, the Cilium agent, just for fun. And unfortunately, I thought I'd get it done this morning, and I'm a little behind. So I'll just have to record a video.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
Native approach to KNI and Cilium.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I'm sure everybody would love to see that. So I'm looking forward to you having a bit more time to polish that up and get that out.
Definitely.
Excellent. Well, cool, fantastic. So if you do see Mike out and about up a mountain, sat in front of his laptop, please do say hi, as long as he's not too focused on kind of getting some code out the door. I'd like to say thank you for Mike for joining today and having this conversation. And thank you everybody who joined and was part of today's conversation as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to Mike and thank you to everybody, and we will see you all next time.
Definitely. Cool. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.